Welcome, everyone, to TRT World Forum's digital debates on our session on Biden's visit to the Middle East, an enduring re-engagement or temporary fix. On July 16th, U.S. President Joe Biden wrapped up a highly anticipated visit to the Middle East that included stops in Israel, the Occupied Palestinian Territories, and Saudi Arabia, of course. While in Saudi Arabia, Biden attended a summit meeting of the GCC that included the participation of Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt, otherwise known as the GCC plus 3. He also met with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the first meeting, virtual or otherwise, between the two since Biden took office, and after campaign vows to turn Saudi Arabia into an international pariah, in response to a range of issues ranging from the murder of Jamal Khashoggi to the war in Yemen. Much of the media coverage of the trip was focused on Biden's so-called fist bump with MBS, overshadowing the substantive developments to emerge out of the meetings. Beyond that, the nature of the meetings and the topics discussed pointed to a shift in U.S. relations with its traditional regional partners, which is perhaps not wholly captured by the pivot to Asia or end of Pax Americana narratives. To informed observers, the primary objective of the trip appears to have been meant to signal to its regional partners, but also importantly to its adversaries, that the U.S. continues to be committed to the region and takes its strategic interests in the region seriously. Whether or not, however, this re-engagement will prove to be enduring or simply a temporary and political fleeting moment remains to be seen. And joining me to discuss this and many other topics that will flow into this one, we have Dr. Khalil Jahshan, Executive Director of the Arab Center in Washington, D.C., Dr. Andreas Krieg, Senior Lecturer at School of Security Studies and at King's College and Fellow at the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies, Dr. Abdullah Baabood, Chair of the State of Qatar for Islamic Area Studies and Visiting Professor at the School of International Liberal Studies at Waseda University. And last but not least, Jonathan Panikov, Director of the Snowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Dr. Jahshan, I want to start with you, and I want to kind of take a bit of a high-level look at this visit. So we're 2 weeks out now, or just over 2 weeks out from this trip. In your view, what are the major takeaways from this trip that Biden took?
Frankly, the major takeaways from this trip are in the eye of the beholder. It depends on how you look at this whole ordeal from your political or geographic perspective. Definitely, from the very beginning, just for the sake of transparency, let me say I felt from the very beginning that this trip that the president had to make, but probably didn't get much for it, was ill-conceived and ill-timed. The reason I say that, because first of all, the president felt somewhat guilty about doing this trip at this particular time, and somehow for domestic reasons mostly, framed the visit in domestic terms to please the pro-Israel camp within his party, particularly. That's where most of the criticism was coming for the trip, particularly the human rights community, and most of that complaint was focused on the Saudi stop in the trip. He somehow put it in Israeli perspective, and he described it personally, and I'm quoting him, saying that this trip is aimed at strengthening the national security of Israel. Well, if that's the case, then why do you have to go to the other two stops? And particularly when you have nothing at all to deliver with regards to one stop, that's the Palestinian territories. So the purposes for the visit, announced and not announced, were essentially to try to respond to the sentiment prevalent in the region, particularly among U.S. Arab allies, that the U.S. is pivoting away from the region. They were upset with that, and he wanted to kind of, if you will, respond to that. The second one is the issue of oil. He went there for domestic reasons, oil prices at the pump. Some of us living in the States were somewhat worried about paying more than $5 a gallon at the pump, and he wanted to put an end to that rising, the trend in rising prices. And the third is Iran. He knew there were differences with all his allies in the region, particularly Israel and Saudi Arabia and other Gulf allies. And he still was intending to try to gain some support from them for continued negotiations regarding the JCPOA. So some people kind of exaggerated the results for their own political reasons, both here at the White House, in Saudi Arabia, in Israel, and even in Palestine. But frankly, in terms of peace and stability in the region, which is my own personal focus as far as all these stops, I would, if Biden was in one of my classes, I would give him F-, because I don't feel the region today, as a result of the trip a couple of weeks ago, is more stable than it was before the trip.
Thank you for that, Dr. Jahshan. I guess we'll continue with this line of question. I'm curious to get sort of all of your perspectives on this kind of, major takeaways. So Dr. Jahshan, of course, talked about some of these domestic political elements as well as some of the other major reasons for going. Dr. Babood, I want to throw the same question to you. So from your perspective, what are the major takeaways from this trip, both in terms of, let's say, these shorter term political issues, but also in terms of the sort of wider picture of American engagement in the region? I think your microphone is still muted there, Dr. Abdullah.
Right. Thank you. I apologize for that. Thank you, Michael. And I echo what Khalil had just mentioned, and if you like, I'll add a few things there. I think this trip has confirmed that what we hear about, the values of American policies or American values, etc. When it comes to national interests, those values take a secondary role, as it were, and national interest is, of course, comes first, which is understood. But that is something that we've learned from this. And the other one, I think, it confirmed that domestic politics sometimes, or in most cases, actually override international or foreign policy. It also confirmed that the United States really has no real interest in resolving some of the lingering issues that are still happening in the Middle East, whether it is, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian issue, what Biden is saying, again, two-state solution, what does that mean? And he even did not think that he's, this is not going to be done in a hurry or in our lifetime. So basically, this is going to linger for a very long time. And this is one of the issues that, that the region is looking for a solution from the United States, given its role. It also, one of the other takes, if you like to add to this, is that the importance of the region. However, one wants to ignore the region, this region continues to be quite important because of its strategic location on one hand, but also because of its strategic value in terms of energy resources. So I think that has confirmed the importance of the region. It also confirmed to everyone that you cannot trust the American policy. It can go either way, and it really is. You cannot put your, if you like, money on it. Another take, if you like, from this is I think it is important. This has shown the importance, of course, of the region, but also particularly of Saudi Arabia. In this regard, and what Biden had been, his position vis-a-vis either MBS or Saudi Arabia, we've seen how this is how this is changed because of this visit. I think also it confirmed, if I may, and I will end here, is that that the United States really is not going for or trying to avoid any military confrontation with Iran. And trying to find a peaceful way of containing the Iranian ambitions for nuclear technology, and it is trying to push its partners, as it were, to kind of work with it on this manner. And I think there are some moves that we are hearing now that this is maybe something that it could happen quite quickly. I can go on for long, but I think I'll leave it here, if I may, Michael. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Jonathan Panikoff, in this context, do you think this visit was more a reflection of U.S. domestic political concerns, or perhaps more accurately say concerns in Washington, D.C., maybe not reflecting the entire country, but a Washington, D.C. type of concern? Or is there sort of something brewing here in terms of some of these points that other speakers have talked to, in terms of a different type of engagement in the region, a different strategic outlook developing that perhaps is not fully coherent yet? But is this sort of the beginnings of that, or more of just a political ploy from the Biden administration?
Yeah, so thanks so much, Michael. I'm going to slightly dissent here from my esteemed colleagues who spoke before. I think that if the expectation was that this trip was somehow going to massively create re-engagement or really change the nature of U.S. involvement in the region, obviously that was somewhat folly to have that perspective. In fact, by the same token, I think any view that this was taken for energy reasons is also probably slightly misguided. The reality is both the Saudis and the Emiratis, who are the only ones with meaningful spare capacity, that spare capacity for oil production is still limited. So, the fact that we've seen a drop in gas prices and oil prices is more about global commodities dropping across the board than it is about, I think, a reflection of this trip. Though, credit to the president, he's going to get, some credit for it as a correlation, not a causation. I think on the Israel portion of this trip, look, my sense is the president, but for COVID, would have been in Israel during his first year. I certainly agree with Dr. Jashan. I don't think that, there's a great impetus in terms of really looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I also think part of that is that the partners just don't exist for it. The Israelis are going to head to elections in November. If it's a right-wing government, there won't be a government in Israel that's particularly interested in resolving the conflict. And the Palestinians, I've got no reason to believe that President Abbas is at a point right now where he'd be willing to make any move, frankly, that would sacrifice or risk his legacy at this point to reach a conclusion to the conflict. I just don't think there's the political will on either side. So I don't blame the Biden administration for not really making that a priority right now, that they don't have the partnership. I think in Saudi Arabia, look, in my mind, I agree with what has been said. I think there was very minimal gains. I think some of them were pretty interesting, right? A possible 5G, 6G advancement, working together on cyber, working together on space, possible investment by the Saudis into what is PGII that the president announced at the G7, which really would be about, can we counter as a Western alliance with our European colleagues, China's BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. If we can do that, then obviously it'll have meaning, but we'll see what comes of that. I thought fundamentally this trip was about resetting the relationship because it had been so bad. And what was worse than not having a clear direction in the relationship was the purgatory it was in. It was not clear whether the Biden administration was going to follow the comments and the views that it espoused during the campaign about putting human rights as the sole priority and therefore making Saudi Arabia a pariah, or whether it was going to decide that, look, Saudi Arabia is too important. And after 18 months of purgatory, I actually thought it was a real positive that the president went and made progress, not progress on any specific issue in a major way, but fundamentally progress on resetting the relationship and saying, look, we're not going to give up on human rights, but we're going to make more progress on human rights by engaging Saudi Arabia than by leaving the space open, for instance, to China and Russia, which is where Saudi would turn. And we have seen some progress on that. The fact that we've seen another continuation of the deal, of the cessation of hostilities in Yemen, is meaningful. So my sense is, U.S. politics, it doesn't have much of a play here domestically. I think it is the restart of something. But what that something is, I think, is still yet to be determined. I think, and this is where I'll end, I think the question is going to be, can the U.S. and Saudi Arabia expand the relationship from the traditional contours that have just been energy and defense for so many decades to actually something that's more holistic on issues of cyber, on investment, on space, on healthcare, all of the things that the president talked about beginning. And if they can, then we'll look back on this years from now as the beginning of that. If they can't, and it's going to be pretty challenging, then we'll say that it didn't do much, but at least it reset the relationship from the purgatory it was in and made clear the U.S. direction that we're heading.
Thank you for that. Dr. Andreas, I'll give you the last word on this topic. So again, we're looking at this high-level takeaway a couple weeks later. There's been, just yesterday, the State Department approved the sale of Patriot missile systems and THAAD missiles to the UAE. So, we're starting to see what appears to be some, I guess, after effects or bubblings from this visit. What's your view on the major takeaways here?
Well, I agree with most what was said. I would say, adding to this, and we kind of touched upon it, we looked at it from the perspective of energy, logistics. I think there is a grand strategic picture in this, and I think it's great power competition that we didn't really touch upon. And I think in this respect, if that was the main objective, and I think from the communication that came out of Washington, it was definitely one of the major objectives. I don't think that the U.S. administration has actually achieved anything in that regard. The demands that were put on the table from the U.S. weren't really met in terms of energy. I agree with Jonathan. There wasn't really anything the UAE or Saudi Arabia could actually provide. In return, the Americans did provide defense sales or promises of defense sales. Most of the MOUs that were that came out of it, or many of the talks, actually not even MOUs, there were narratives that came out of the summit about energy and about cyber and investments are very early days. We don't really know if anything comes out of it. The problem is all partners, all U.S. partners in the Jeddah summit, including the U.S., don't really have a grand strategic vision of where this relationship is supposed to go. That is true for the U.S. And the problem is when we analyze U.S. foreign and security policy, always do it by administration rather than looking at the broader American vision for what does America stand for in the MENA region, what does America stand for more globally. As Abdullah was saying, there's this thing where we always talk about values, but in the end of the day, interests always trump values. And in that regard, the question that we in Europe are asking ourselves is whether the U.S. is actually, whether this administration is actually very different from the Trump administration, and the answer is probably no. And that's probably also true for many in the MENA region, where they're saying actually still a very transactional relationship. There is a lot of veneer of fluffy liberal values that come with these narratives that they spill, but in the end of the day, it's about hard power politics, realpolitik. That will prevail in the United States. And the problem with that is that I think the Biden administration has gone out on such a huge ticket on human rights and then didn't deliver on it, which really undermines the credibility of the U.S., not necessarily with the regimes that they're dealing with, but definitely with the people in the Arab world or in the Middle East. And there is a huge credibility gap that is just widening. And again, I'm not blaming the Biden administration. I think what we see is a continuation of a process that has already been set in motion very much with the start of the Iraq war, if you will, of a declining U.S., an empire that is in decay, and an empire that is no longer able to kind of live up to its ambitions. And that's not necessarily a problem because, after all, the Americans are still the most important extra-regional power in this part of the world. The Chinese and the Russians are competing, but not on the same scale. The difference is, though, the Russians and the Chinese don't have these kind of overly ambitious short-term objectives that they're trying to achieve. They're playing an entirely different game. They have a lot more strategic patience. And the US always comes in with a zero-sum approach of saying it's either us or else. And this is no longer possible in a multipolar world. And if the ambition for the US administration was to kind of sever the relationship between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi in particular with Beijing and with Moscow, then this was a clear failure, and it was always going to be a failure because the US has very little to offer in comparison to what China and Russia offers, or at least what it offers is complementary to what China and Russia is offering. So for the partners in the region, and that goes for all 6 GCC countries, but also for Egypt, what they are looking for, they need to look for alternatives. Here is a United States that has not been living up to its superpower status. Whether superpower still exists is another debate, but hasn't really lived up to its ambitions, has left the region to its own devices, has, the Obama administration has said leading from behind. Trump has continued that, saying we are willing to empower you, we're willing to give you all the arms and the weapons so that you can defend yourselves. But the burden of warfare, the burden of conflict in the region has to be borne by local actors. And that's exactly what is happening. And we've seen this gap definitely emerging during the Arab Spring. And this gap was filled. It was filled first by Qatar and then later on by the UAE, and Saudi was also meddling with it. And all of these countries do their own thing in their own national interest. They're not following US guidelines on this. And, if you look at values and ideology, which is very important in that part of the world, then I would say that the authoritarians are the ones that just more naturally pivot towards Asia, pivot towards the likes of Russia and China, because ideologically there are just much deeper synergies. And then you have the US that is moving into this part of trying to move back in, but not offering anything in values, not offering anything in terms of real tangible security, commitments. Because even these defensive deals that were announced yesterday, or that haven't been signed yet, but at least they will probably be signed eventually. These are very defensive weapon systems that basically, again, suggest to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, in case things go wrong, in case JCPOA doesn't work out, in case there will be a war, you can defend yourselves, but we're not going to defend you. And that's very clear. And that's kind of the expectation. So if I was sitting in Abu Dhabi or in Riyadh or in any other Gulf state for that matter, I would probably think, okay, how can I secure myself? And then the US isn't the partner that you can solely rely upon. So you have to diversify. And that in itself comes with diversification of energy interest, diversification of logistics, supply chain. That means the US is an important player, but it's one among many. And that's the reality of the region that we live in. And that also means that the US will have to scale down the expectations of what they will get in return from their partners on the ground.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that last point is important, is often missed, is this idea that, yes, absolutely, the Americans are still the most important player in the region, but they aren't the only game in town, so to speak, and we're dealing with a different environment now than we have in the past several decades. So I want to come back to that in a bit to talk a little bit more about this kind of great power, larger strategic context. But right now, I just want to focus a bit on both U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia as being sort of one of the key pivots in the region, but also in general with its partners there. So actually, Jonathan, I want to come back to you on this. So of course, all things considered, the U.S.-Saudi relationship is not a relationship of equals. And one argument can be made that the relationship is much more critical for the Saudis than it is for the Americans. With regards to Biden's trip and sort of all the context that surrounds it, have the Saudis gotten more out of this than the Americans did? And if we're looking at sort of the future trajectory of the relationship, taking into context what all the speakers have said, and particularly what Dr. Andreas spoke to, and sort of this transactional, kind of short-termist thinking that seems to revolve around it, what are we looking at as we move forward?
So I think it's an interesting question, because you're at a point now where my sense is anybody that says they know exactly what the evolution of the relationship is going to be is probably guessing more than actually has facts, in part because of what Andreas said. I think he's right in that we're seeing a change in the environment of, it's not just hedging. I think there's a real need for the Emiratis, for the Saudis to say, look, we need things from other states that you're not going to be willing to provide U.S. or have the capability to provide. It's especially true on the economic side, especially true when China's looking in terms of foreign investment. But look, it's also true for the first time on a security dimension, right? The U.S. is unwilling to sign a contract to send certain military equipment, whether it's UAVs. And so the Emiratis said, okay, fine, then we'll get them from China. They're not as good, but maybe they're 90% as good, and that's good enough for us. And that creates a very, very different dynamic. I think for the US, one of the things that is going to be a lesson here is that you're going to need to have greater partners. And I don't just mean greater partners in the Gulf. I mean greater partners in terms of your traditional alliances. In other words, in order to push back against China and probably Russia to a lesser extent in the region, you're going to have to do a better job of enhancing your relationship with our European allies and with NATO allies, because otherwise you're not going to have the scale. And so that means that, for instance, if the US refuses to sell the F-35s to the Emiratis, for instance, you may have to be okay and even supportive of the fact that, look, they're not going to China to get them. They're going to go to France to look for the 80 Rafales instead. Those sorts of trade-offs are something that the US hasn't had to deal with before. And I think from a grand strategy perspective, we need to really start thinking about how to do that. Now, with Saudi in particular, I think MBS certainly did get what he wanted, right? I may think there was kind of a recognition that he's back on the world stage. But again, it wasn't just about the US. It was about the fact that he then met with French President Emmanuel Macron right after he saw President Biden, right? It's about saying the Khashoggi killing and the prosecution of the war in Yemen, both horrid, terrible, tragic. There's been a decision that's been made that it's not going to actually, at the moment, stop relations, simply because the US, Europe, needs Saudi Arabia. There's needs that we have, not just from a security perspective, but also from an economic perspective. I think there's a real concern both in Brussels and Washington about long-term, if you don't have that gap filled, that China comes in and fills that gap. And I think it's a much easier relationship with China simply because of the autocratic nature of both some of the Middle East regimes as well as China and Beijing. And so it becomes a very zero-sum game. And by the US filling that gap, at least you ensure that it's US, European, traditional Western rules that are being played by. Or are you going to risk long-term, for instance, China building more ports, China being more involved in a military perspective that then says, look, freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas is not going to be by the traditional US rules. It's going to be by China, and China deciding to stop things. So I think the US gets from this a reset, but it also gets long-term viability to at least be able to compete in the region with its biggest rival. And I think for the US, and this is where I'll end, but I think for the US, the big focus is on China and what the adversary relationship is going to be and how it's going to develop. And that means that the prism through which we think about other regions, including the Middle East, is going to be, how does this fit into the US's broader strategy vis-a-vis countering China? And that takes you down a very different path than we've been down, say, in the last 30 years, in the last 40 years, vis-a-vis our relationship. But the Saudis, at the end of the day, still need us and still want U.S. military equipment. Right? It's still the priority. But it's not going to have the same impact of being able to demand from the U.S. side what we used to and just say, do this or else. Because now you're seeing most of the Gulf states saying, fine, we'll take the or else and we'll go to other alternative suppliers. And I think that's what the U.S. is really going to have to negotiate going forward.
Dr. Jahshan, on this kind of point, we've talked a little bit about, I guess, hedging on the part of some traditional U.S. partners. This has been particularly the case, at least sort of more publicly discussed, by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. There's been efforts to seeking to diversify their strategic relationships, weapons procurement in particular, and moving those away from some American suppliers. The UAE's burgeoning relationship with France is an example in this regard. Saudi Arabia's 2021 military cooperation agreement with Russia and the UAE's deal of the purchase for the Rafale fighter jets from France, which we've discussed very briefly here, as an example as well. Can we contextualize these types of moves as part of a more general effort on the part of these states to move towards more, I guess we could say, strategic autonomy from the United States? Or is there an element in here that's also sort of perhaps designed to pressure Washington and to pressure the arms manufacturing business in the United States, where you have these large customers that are saying, okay, well, we're going to go elsewhere now, knowing that could play into a certain amount of domestic U.S. political concerns around jobs, economy, this type of thing. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that coming from Washington, D.C. there.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. I think it's a very complex question. There is no doubt about it, but it's not the traditional complexity that we had to face in the past in trying to confront or answer this question, which is not new. We know that the bilateral relationship between Washington and Riyadh is not one between equals, will not be tomorrow or in the distant future. It will continue to be a lopsided relationship. The question is, this change is happening, or this questioning by our allies is happening at a time when there is more change in the region, in the makeup of policies within, let's say, the establishment of our allies, more than there is change in our own perspective in terms of the U.S. policy changing. So even when you say something as simple as it is not a relationship between equals, try to convince this new generation that Mohammed bin Salman has unleashed over the past couple of years that they are not equal to the U.S. And try to convince them that this visit did not prove that. They are totally convinced that the visit proved it, that Biden came over and totally compromised and gave up on his antagonistic policy of making the kingdom a pariah state, as he declared during his campaign for the presidency. So there is a serious element of change that makes the answer even much more complicated and much more unsettled than it has been for years. I mean, those of us who have been studying and dealing with the bilateral relationship between Riyadh and Washington for decades, this is not what we are witnessing today under Mohammed bin Salman. Is a very hybrid and new version of Saudi foreign policy. It is not his father's foreign policy. I knew his dad very well, worked with him very closely on some issues. And that's not the same foreign policy his dad followed. It's not the same foreign policy his uncle Abdullah followed for many years. So you're looking at a new creation that the U.S. system, foreign policy making system, has not adjusted to yet, has not incorporated in its own thinking, and has not fully absorbed, if you will, the relevance and the extent of that change. Take, for example, the conclusion. Maybe it was emotional on the part of Princess Reem bint Bandar, the Saudi ambassador to Washington, during or immediately after the visit, when she said that visit ends the oil for security formula that governed our relationship in the past. I'm sorry, with all due respect to the ambassador, I'm not sure it did. I don't think it did. As a matter of fact, it confirmed it beyond what was already confirmed in the past. That's what we ended up with anyway. Some sort of arrangement, all for security, and the prices at the pump prove that 25 to 75 cents drop did not happen by accident, and it's not, of course, the impact of these two countries, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and others in the region, cannot only be interpreted in terms of barrels per day. The psychology of this meeting also played a role. Psychology made the drop happen more than barrels per day, whether they have the capacity or not. The drop, the increase in production began before the visit, continued during the visit, and was accelerated after the visit, whether we like it or not. And they do deserve credit for the drop in price, even if it's limited to just psychology. And the market is impacted by psychology as much as it is by the quantity of production. So, what is happening is change. And you could tell there is a struggle in trying to cope with that change, both here and in capitals of our allies in the region. And things have not been settled yet. And the visit did not necessarily contribute much to clarifying that relationship, including one of the key factors, that this business of pivoting to Asia that you guys just talked about. Look, I mean, there are people in this town who want to pivot away from the region, including some in this administration. Yes, maybe more pronounced in the previous administration, but even in this administration. But frankly, even though some of these people are willing to divorce in this strange marriage of convenience that brings the U.S. and its Arab allies together, whatever that Shiite phenomenon is, the other side is not willing to consider divorce.
Thank you, Dr. Jahshan. Dr. Andreas, so, we touched a little bit on this idea of, the traditional basis for the bilateral relationship with Saudi Arabia in particular, the oil for security agreement. And with regards to these meetings, both the Saudi and the American side have been, speaking about how this recent meeting was laying the groundwork for the next 70 years of bilateral relations, which is fairly ambitious with all this change going on. Nevertheless, of course, the U.S. now is not itself directly dependent on energy from the Middle East, but as we've been discussing here, it clearly has an interest in ensuring the free flow of energy to the global market, et cetera, and sort of maintaining that kind of energy frame relationship, with the Saudis in particular. If we're looking at these 70 years that both the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are talking about, in the context of this energy transition, which it remains to be seen how sort of deep that goes, but there's a momentum towards that. In that context, some have pointed to the fact that in less than 70 years' time, the U.S. may not have any particular interest in the Middle East anymore. What do you make of this argument, and how can these sort of seemingly irreconcilable points be reconciled? Looking at long-term relationships, but in this context, which is still dominated by this energy security frame.
Well, I think that what is important to highlight here is that the U.S. didn't come to Jeddah or didn't leave Jeddah as a leader, but as a follower. And I think, I agree with Khalil here that, that the U.S. was very much following a Saudi or a Gulf line on this. And I think more of this is going to happen. They want a relationship on par. I think we've been all very surprised when the UAE over the last 5 or 6 years started to play a bit more hardball with the United States and other, great power, middle powers in Europe. But that's now the new status quo, and the Saudis are playing along with it. The difference here is that I think the Saudis haven't really made up their mind of what it is that they really want. I don't think they have necessarily a strategy post the Jeddah summit. They don't really know what they can do or want to do with that sort of influence that they have now, and with the potential normalization that's going to happen around MBS. The Emiratis, on the other hand, I think are a country that very much know what they want. They are probably the only country in the region that have a very firm grand strategy, a very firm strategy. They have the means and ways to achieve it as well. And they are probably the only country that maintained a very firm line over the last decade. And they are kind of pushing into, very hardball, zero-sum mentality, but they're very much moving into filling, or they moved already into filling a gap and becoming potentially one of the most powerful countries, if not the most powerful country in the Middle East. So for the US moving forward, it will be very difficult to deal with them within the mentality of top-down, how Washington used to play that game. They, the last decade have brought with it a huge transformation. Also in, these countries were, if you look at the end of the Bush era, or the beginning of the Bush era, in the early 2000s, these countries were still very much in a development stage, and they now are, in the last decade, they moved into more proactive stage where they actually have acquired power, they've acquired influence, they acquired and built networks, and network-centric statecraft is immensely important for these fairly small states, but still very powerful, influential states. And they now know how they can use that influence and power to achieve their own interests. And that will recalibrate the relationship that these countries have, not just with Washington, but also with the middle powers and former colonial powers in Europe. And that means that and then obviously we have to think about what Abdullah said as well. The Gulf will remain very, very important, not just for energy, also in energy, because the energy transition that is happening, the push towards green energy in most of these countries is definitely moving forward, because that's the future for them as well. Whether it will happen with the same pace that is required, or certain countries will have different pace because they have different demands and different requirements that they need to meet. But nonetheless, they're part of that. So, but even beyond energy, we should think about the Middle East as a buffer zone. That's the kind of the bufferstan between East and West. And if we talk about great power competition between China and the United States, then the Middle East is right in the middle of it. And the United States requires partners on the ground it can work with. The question is whether these partners are willing to do America's bidding. And I think we've seen over the last couple of years and maybe even decade that these partners are increasingly reluctant to do so. It's not about them being unable to do so, but them being reluctant to do so. I think the only country that has really, at least in the last couple of years, also due to the Gulf crisis, has really played a very pro-American, almost saying yes to anything the Americans ever asked them, role was Qatar. And I think even the Qataris, I think, would be well advised to kind of reconsider that approach of saying, actually, do we want to always, act almost like a vassal state for the United States and always say yes to anything the US will ask us? Or are we also using the influence that we have to achieve what is in our national interest? Because that's what the neighbors are doing as well. And that question goes to all the 6 GCC countries in terms of reconsidering their role in the world and their role between East and West. And in that kind of context, I think in the next 70 years, we will see the US in decline. I cannot see how, with all that's going on, I can't see how the US will maintain its current status. And that's also not only due to its foreign and security policy and the mismatch between ends and means and ways, but I think there is a domestic dimension to it where America is weakened from within. And that kind of internal decay is something that I don't see how the Americans will actually deal with it. There's so much, and that's not just the Biden administration, that's not Trump. These are all symptoms. The current narratives in the political domain are symptoms of a much deeper crisis, and that will weaken the United States. And that comes at a time when other powers are moving into that space, and the Middle East themselves and the GCC countries themselves are a power to reckon with. So over the next 70 years, I don't think that the Americans are necessarily able to play that kind of quid pro quo game. I think they will be probably played a little bit more than them playing the countries in the region, because the countries in the region, have in many respects have a lot more leverage on some issues when it comes to supply chains. We haven't even talked about, when we talk about defense and security, we still talk, and that's what the Americans are getting wrong. There's still very much talk about conventional kinetic warfare. Conventional kinetic means the Americans and the Western military industrial complex is still providing what these countries need, and they're kind of, supplying something that no one else can supply on that level. However, if we're moving into the next revolution of military affairs, into the AI and cyber domain, Eastern countries, most importantly China, have a competitive edge over the West. And I think that's where the UAE relationship with high-tech companies and AI companies in China comes in, where Asia is a lot more important than America. And that is a security. That's not about investments in economy. That's about security and defense. So, with all these changes happening, I think the US will be increasingly a follower in this part of the world, not necessarily a leader.
That's interesting points. Dr. Mahmoud, I want to just kind of go on a bit of a tangent here, but talk about, we've talked a lot about Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and for understandable reasons, but as Dr. Andreas mentioned as well, there's other players in the GCC, and then there's the GCC itself as sort of a, as an organization. If we're looking at other actors, Qatar in particular as being the most important of the ones that are left in the UAE, or left in the region, sorry. Is there a sort of a different model of relationship there that with the Americans? Does this offer sort of a different view of how this relationship could move forward, or are ultimately the same sort of dynamics that are pushing the Saudis and the Emiratis in a certain direction ultimately going to play out with the Qataris, with the Kuwaitis, with others as well?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I think let me just take a step back and say, like, what is going on in the region and the talk that we hear from time to time about the pivot towards the American pivot towards Asia. We have to remember that this is not just an American pivot towards Asia. It's also a Gulf pivot towards Asia. Gulf states are pivoting in a very dramatic way towards Asia. If you look at their economic relations, the energy geopolitics, as it were, investments, all of that is now moving more towards Asia, and Asia becoming very important players in Gulf economic development and Gulf future. And therefore, you can understand why the Gulf states would also want to have good relationship with China, with other Asian powers, as it were, and develop Asian markets. Another thing we have to also look at when we're talking about the region and the changes that are taking place is the perception of leadership. We now have a different leadership that different from the previous leadership. Succession in the Gulf has brought up some new leaders with a new way of looking at things, and they are more astute, as it were, and they know how to play the game and the statecraft. So they are trying to find ways to enhance their own interest beyond what the hegemonic power wants them to do, and especially when they see that their future is moving more towards Asia as well. So you can understand why these countries will start looking towards Asia and building some more strategic relationship with Asia. The other thing is, of course, this is all part of strategic hedging as well, with the Asian countries. But they also understand that there is no other country at the moment that can guarantee security more than the United States. So at the same time, they want to keep that relationship, but they don't want to keep that relationship in a way that it costs them. It costs their future, it costs their economic development, etc. And small states always find an agency. They find ways of maneuvering around a situation like this, and they are quite adept to such situation. They're quite fast in acting and seeing their own interest. I think the United States is not only a power in decline. We can debate that for a long time, but it is definitely a power that is losing its strategic partners in the Gulf, whether it is Gulf states or Middle Eastern governments that are pivoting also towards Asia, but it's also losing the public because of the United States policies and not standing with the ideologies and of course the values that the United States stands for. It's losing its image in the region. It's losing its image amongst the people. And it's also losing its power amongst the leaders. And I think we are really talking about a global change, or quite an important change, a paradigm shift that is going to happen, not necessarily today, but if we look like in the future, we see that the public is not happy with the United States and the fact that it vacillates between human rights on one hand and interest on another. And you can't believe them and can't trust them, and also the leaders don't trust the United States because of all the things that has been mentioned. Therefore, we are going to see a major shift towards Asia, and that will include not only Saudi Arabia, which is, I believe, has taken a decision long time ago, and it's not recent, to diversify its portfolio of partners, but also all the Gulf states. And I think Andreas just mentioned that Qatar is also advised to do so. And I think they are doing so. If you look at the investment, if you look at the trade and economic relationship that are taking place, we see a lot happening with Russia, with China. And that goes also for Kuwait, it goes for Oman, it goes for Bahrain as well. And of course, the United Arab Emirates and the UAE are leading in this transformation. So I think we are going to see quite a big transformation, especially given that the credibility gap with the United States is enlarging over time, and we are seeing much more self-confidence within these leaders within the Gulf states. And I think this trip has also shown that that actually these leaders can force a global power and make the United States president come and to visit them when he called Saudi Arabia a pariah state. So these kind of messages that are building up, and the image that is building up, if you like, first a trust and confidence in themselves, and then a lack of confidence in the United States leadership, is going to create some more dramatic change that we're going to see in the future that could create a paradigmic shift, if you like, in the way that the relationship are going to happen in the future. It's difficult to see how this is going to happen, but I think the lines and the indications are clear, and we are seeing more pivot to Asia from the Gulf states, more than the United States pivot towards Asia. And I'll stop here if you like.
Thank you. And actually, Dr. Mahmoud, I want to stick with you here for this next part. We'll start with you. So, we've touched on it a little bit, but, there's been this sense, I think, from the Obama administration in particular onwards, and been continuity through Trump and through the years of Biden so far, that a growing sense amongst U.S. partners in the region that American security commitments in particular are either waning or perhaps, as Dr. Andreas has pointed to, are no longer enough for the sort of the what's coming in the future. Of course, more immediately, this has been driven by numerous factors, including U.S. inaction in Syria, what amounts to perhaps ceding the initiative to the Russians there in 2015, but also a perceived lack of response to Iran, and of course the withdrawals from Iraq, and most recently the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Looking at Biden's visit, but also outside of this particular visit, of course, this is just providing us the context. Were any of the developments to come out of these meetings, both sort of the official ones that come from the readouts, but also as Dr. Krieg put it, the narratives around these meetings from both sides, was this enough to kind of assuage some of these concerns, or is this sort of part of a larger, structural issue that we're seeing here?
Yeah, very interesting question, an important question. Thank you, Michael. And I think this again goes back to what I was saying earlier, that we are seeing a big structural change, in global power, if you like, relations, and also in how the region is responding to that. And as I said, also that some of the Gulf states, of not all of them, have taken a strategic decision, and this is not kind of a product of today. This has been going on for some time because of the reasons that you've just alluded to. Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, Yemen, all of those. The United States not selling them arms and the time they need it. They United States use human rights when it wants to, and then it stops it when it's in its own interest. All of these kind of contradictions has pushed the leaders in the Gulf states to look beyond the United States and look even beyond Europe as well, and especially as their fortunes are now being dependent on in Asia and how Asia is developing. And we're seeing how they are all trying to bring in, of course, Chinese investments and be part of the BRI, etc. And we are seeing that they are building some very important strategic relationship with China. So obviously, this is a structural change that are going to take place. It is taking place as we talk now, and I don't think this visit has actually added anything to alter that vision. If anything, it gave them more confidence that they were right, and we can force the United States, we can force the leader of the United States to come. We still have the power, and we can play it. We are important countries. We are strategic countries. We have strategic commodities that is important for the world. Our, geostrategic position is very important. So even, Biden, who once called Saudi Arabia what he did, and he refused to deal with MBS, he came to bow to us, to ask us to help him in this situation. What kind of messages this is going to the young leaders, very ambitious leaders? I think it's giving them the idea that they are that they can do what they want, and they will go for it, and they can force the United States or any other power, as it were, to work for their own best interests, and that is acceptable. That is what you expect them to do. I don't think this visit has really done anything in terms of changing the image of the United States. In fact, if anything, it has destroyed that image at the public level as well, because people do not trust the United States, and where's the values that you're talking about, the human rights and all of that. So at the public level, and what are you doing for the Israeli-Palestinian issues? Isn't it enough? All of those questions are raised by the public, and at the official level, yes, we can do what we want, and we can get away with it, and no one is there to tell us what to do, because we have power, and that is, we have this commodity that the world wants, and it is important, and we can get away with this. And I think this is quite dangerous. The message is that this visit is giving to the region is quite dangerous, because we've seen how dangerous this region can be, and how dangerous some of these leaders can be, and how difficult it can be, in terms of conflicts and so on, whether it is in Yemen or with Iran and all of that. This is, I think this visit hasn't really helped much. It hasn't, despite all the ho-ha and all the, what we hear in the media from both sides. I think I would give it a minus in that sense, and I don't think it has helped the United States either, except it may be seen by Biden that it is helping him in his re-election and trying to reduce the cost of gasoline in the United States and all of that. But I don't think it is in the long term going to help the United States, and not necessarily the region. And this is really unfortunate, because we really don't have a policy from the United States towards the region, how to deal with this region in the future, and how to make sure that its strategic interests are served, not only by relationship with the leaders and the governments, but also with the people. And I think the United States are losing at all fronts in this direction.
Thank you, Mr. Babood. Jonathan, I want to come to you and sort of we talked about concerns of American partners about Washington, D.C.'s commitment. But of course, in Washington, D.C. itself, there's been a growing sense for some time, which I think transcends administrations as well, that its partners in the region have not been pulling their weight, particularly regarding security issues that the United States deems to be vital to its interests. We've seen this with the reaction to the Ukraine war, for example, and America's efforts to isolate Russia internationally. I think there's been an assumption in Washington for many years that decades of financial and security assistance to Israel, to Saudi Arabia, to Jordan, etc., would automatically translate into support for U.S. Priorities, which, of course, as we've been discussing here today, and which we've seen in the recent months and years, is proven to be an incorrect assumption. How does this sort of affect the relationship moving forward? And I realize this is perhaps more an issue of framing than anything else, but is it possible to see this as a more sort of mature relationship developing, or is it really kind of the sense that there is a lack of trust between the sides, and that lack of trust is not going away anytime soon, and so the basis of the relationship becomes almost purely transactional more than anything else?
So I think the reality is that it's been transactional for a while now, and I think that's probably going to continue. But I think at some point, the truth is going to be that, especially as relations between a lot of the Gulf states primarily and some of the others deepen with China, you're going to probably come up against an issue in the coming years in which the U.S. says, no, this is a bridge too far. You're going to have to make a fundamental choice. At the end of the day, right now, it's still the U.S. who's the preferred security guarantor. And I think that your point about messaging is important here, right? I'm not sure the U.S. for a number of years has done a very good job of it from the side here in Washington, simply because when you talk about pivot to Asia, when you talk about all these things, it doesn't actually match the reality on the ground. If you look at U.S. troop numbers, for instance, in Qatar at Al Udeid, if you look at the U.S. troop numbers with the Fifth Fleet of Bahrain, if you look at the Patriot missiles, which I know drives U.S. policymakers out of their mind, that there's this view that the Saudis only view security guarantees through the prism of Patriot missiles, when that's only one dimension of U.S. security support, right? There's also huge amounts of training, huge amounts of effort. I think the messaging has not been helpful. And I think it also hasn't been helpful, frankly, from the Gulf side, because I think you have a lot of Gulf states who go out and say, no, we've already done so time and time again what you asked us to. I think the Emiratis have talked about being the first in and being one of the few who actually was willing to fight in Afghanistan, for instance, that they've always supported the US other than Iraq. I think a lot of the issue is you've had a perception problem for the US in the Middle East since Iraq. And I don't think that's changed. And so I don't think that the public perception is really what I'm particularly focused on, because we've seen a willingness by a lot of these regimes, and it's the advantage of being an autocratic regime. You don't have to be where your public is in order to make moves. We're seeing that with the Abraham Accords, for instance. If you look at the polling associated with support of the Abraham Accords, even in the United Arab Emirates, it's actually very, very much against from the Emirati population, but it didn't stop MBZ from going ahead and normalizing. I think the question is going to be, from a broader strategic context, how the move by some of the Gulf states and the strategic hedging actually goes. I'm sympathetic to the argument that both Abdullah and Andreas have made in terms of many of the Middle East states turning toward Asia. But I'm also skeptical. I agree with Andreas in that we have a fundamental issue in terms of the U.S. political body over what the next 70 years is going to look like, and can the U.S. prevent itself from cannibalizing itself as a power? At the same time, the pivot to Asia only works, frankly, if China ends up being as powerful as it is trying to be and as it's holding itself out to be. The reality is, and this isn't a China conversation, but I think this is an important point, China has huge structural inefficiencies within their economy. And that works fine when you have 8% growth. It's a real issue when you're at 2-3% growth. This huge demographic challenge, and most importantly, it would be the first time in history, if China really takes a hegemonic role throughout the world, in which there's been no historical example of having the world's largest economy so poor on a per capita basis. All of that has huge impacts on what the relations and the dynamics are like with other countries. It's such an easier relationship with China simply because of the autocratic nature of the regime. But at the same time, I'm not convinced that it's going to be so much about Middle East states turning solely to China as it is about them turning inward towards themselves. Can the Middle East states, and I think we saw this a little bit in COVID, where they discovered, hey, we can actually do things by ourselves. We can do things as a Gulf region. We can do things as, a broader integrated Middle East that we don't need the US for and we don't need China for. We will go to whoever it is offers us the best opportunities and the best deal. And so it becomes much, much more transactional. And that I could certainly say. The one caveat I would raise with this is, look, the one thing we haven't discussed is there's a huge amount of intra-regional tensions. And I think it's a mistake to look at the Middle East and the countries in the Middle East as somehow completely united. I think there's going to be huge issues between the Emirates and the Saudi Arabia over the next decade. I think they have different views of what powers they should have and where they should lead. I think you're seeing already a bit of a coalition forming with the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Iraqis to an extent with the Emiratis that would probably lead the region in a direction that's different than where the Saudis want to lead it, and where the Saudis almost certainly think that they and they alone have the right to be the leader in the region. And so I think some of those dynamics, and it's incredibly complex, as Khalil said, are going to play out more and more, so that, predicting the actual security dynamics or economic dynamics or broader relationship dynamics, it is going to be much more challenging in this multipolar world than it has been. But I'm not sure that just simply saying, it's easy to say, look, they're going all toward Asia. I'm not sure that's exactly true. My sense is that you're talking about strategic hedging is about going toward themselves.
That's a very interesting point. Just before we move on, we're getting low on time, but I want to talk about sort of how this fits into this so-called pivot to Asia, both from the U.S. side and from the Gulf side. But before I do that, Dr. Andreas, I just want to get your thoughts on this particular issue of the nature of the relationship with the U.S. and partners in the Gulf in particular. Does this idea of not always being on the same page, does that imply sort of a conflictual relationship, or is there a possibility of actually sort of having I'm not sure how to frame it, but a more mature relationship where you have cooperation on certain issues, but there's a recognition on sort of both sides that we're not always going to be acting in the same direction?
No, absolutely. I think that's exactly what it's going to be, picking and choosing from both sides, but with more strategic autonomy from the Gulf states than what the Americans are actually used to. And I would also say, I mean, the environment doesn't lend itself to an American and Western view on strategy. And we always in the West try to play chess, and it's always a zero-sum game where we think we need to win at the expense of others. And that's where the Chinese are coming in. The Chinese don't think about hegemony. I don't think we in the West, I think especially the US still thinks about hegemony. That is not something that is applicable to the Middle East. And I think it's not applicable to the multipolar or apolar world that we live in. So in this kind of context, I don't think that both sides have to be on the same page necessarily. The Americans just need to learn how to use strategic power more, and influence more strategically, and that means moving outside the military domain, moving outside the security domain, and moving outside the energy domain, and using all the more softer elements of American influence and power, and using that credibly. And I agree with Abdullah. The problem is that the reputation, the image of the United States in the region is so severely damaged, not just by Biden and Trump, but also by Obama and also by the predecessor Bush. This is not about Democrats versus Republicans. It has to do fundamentally with the lack of an American grand strategy. There is no grand strategic vision in the United States that transcends the political aisle in terms of what America wants to be in the world, and that obviously has an impact on the Middle East, and that will naturally just lead to a more of a withdrawal from the Middle East. I think if you look today where the U.S. grand strategic interests actually are, whoever defines them, and then you see where they put their means and ways, particularly as they overly emphasize the military, then the CENTCOM area, the U.S. Central Command area, still gets a disproportionate attention from Washington when it comes to allocating resources. And I think that will change inevitably, and that means more withdrawal from the MENA region and more partnering. And I think the idea that Obama came up with, leading from behind, the idea of surrogacy, where you delegate statecraft to partners on the ground, isn't a bad one. I think that's the only way America can survive and be actually, engaged in these everywhere and forever wars across the globe. And the Middle East is only a part of that. That's one of the regions where the U.S. needs to lead and build relationships through delegation. The only issue here is that you're delegating to a lot of partners who don't necessarily agree with your objectives and your interest and with your values, and that makes it a very, very difficult one. And the Chinese don't actually need to do much to actually go in there and see some of the opportunities or see some of the gaps that the Americans are leaving behind. So I think it will be a lot more picking and choosing from both sides, which will be more of a partnership on level rather than something which is top down with Americans come in as a hegemon. And I think this is a realization. I mean, anybody who thinks the U.S. is still, looking and dealing and behaving in the region as a hegemon, I think doesn't, misreads what's going on and the dynamics on the ground. Is, we haven't even spoken about Iran. We haven't spoken about Turkey. We haven't spoken about many of the other countries in this part of the world that don't necessarily agree that the United States are still a hegemon. And they have shown that if you look at, particularly what the Iranians have done and achieved over the last 20 years since the Iraq War, how they've expanded their surrogate networks at the expense of the United States, at the expense of the Gulf states as well, then you see that these countries are playing an entirely different game. They probably play something that is more similar to the Chinese version of Go than being similar to what is a Western version of chess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of different actors to touch on here, and we focus primarily on the Gulf due to the meetings, but I think it's a very important point that's being raised. Dr. Jahshan, of course, the Biden administration has inherited a complex legacy, we could say it that way, of American involvement in the region, going back many decades, but for sake of argument, we'll say back to the post September 11th era. Like their predecessors in the Obama and Trump administrations, Biden's national security and foreign policy team, of course, includes a number of veterans from the Obama era. They've declared this intention to downsize the U.S. footprint from the region in response to this great power competition that we've been talking about. They've identified antagonistic authoritarian foreign powers as being their primary national security threat to the United States. In this sort of larger strategic context that the Americans are moving towards, how do we contextualize the relationship with the Middle East moving forward?
One word, change, which is not doesn't seem to be forthcoming by this administration. I think it goes back to what Andreas referred to as the absence of a grand strategy, which is not a partisan issue, Democrat versus Republican. I mean, there are general trends that we witness by Democrat and Republican administrations approaching this issue slightly differently. But the missing ingredient here, or the missing phenomena, is national. And the grand strategy that is missing. So when you look, for example, at what couple of my colleagues referred to earlier in terms of public opinion. Of course, public opinion doesn't dictate public policy anywhere in the world, including in the United States, unfortunately. But it does have an impact, and I think it does have a growing impact. So when I look just a quantitative note to what Abdullah mentioned earlier, and I think Jonathan referred to a little bit, the issue of, pertaining to your question now, Michael, what did the administration inherit? Yes, it inherited a damaged public image in the region. Public opinion doesn't see the U.S. in a healthy manner, regardless of what the regimes think. Of course, international relations are relations between regimes and governments, but you have to factor in public opinion. And when I look at the surveys we have done over the past decade or so at the Arab Opinion Index, at least 7 or 8 successive surveys proved, for example, when you ask 22,000 people that we interviewed in 12 countries in the Arab world, who's your public enemy number one? What is your biggest threat coming from? And of course, 89% say Israel. And yet their governments right now are normalizing with Israel. I mean, how do you reconcile that in light of the change that is happening? U.S., that's what's so surprising. I mean, again, back to your question, the lack of credibility. 65% of Arabs interviewed said the U.S. is the main threat to their national security. Add to that 16 partial threat. So you're talking about 80+% viewing that, and then compare that with the threat we're trying to convince them that they are facing, which is Iran, and you got essentially 57% people see Iran as the number one threat. So forget about what the governments for a moment are saying, and look at what the people are saying, because that's where our credibility hangs in the balance as the United States of America. Yes, it's not Biden's doing, and he inherited it, but he doesn't seem to be coping with it accordingly. China, why is it being viewed as an alternative by the public and by governments? Because only 32% of the Arab public view China as a national interest threat to them. And so this has to be kind of factored in when you deal with that, and particularly if indeed this administration before the end of its term will wake up and try to come up with some kind of a grand strategy for itself in the region.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jahshan. I think just for the sake of time, we'll end there, and I think that was a good transition towards the ending. Of course, there's tons and tons more we could talk about and fill hours and hours with, but I really sincerely appreciate you all taking the time. I know you all have different family responsibilities and different things right now, so we really appreciate it. It was a very interesting discussion. I think more than anything, it reflects that there's a turmoil in this relationship in the global order, and it's going to be characterized by change moving forward And I think out of all the things we discussed, that was the one point of agreement. So thank you again so much for joining us. Really appreciate it, and hopefully we can do this again sometime in the future.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.